Great. It's my pleasure to welcome you now to this session on critical minerals and net zero. I'm Nicky Buckley. I'll be chairing this with a fantastic panel. We have got a lovely room. If the windows bang, we'll push the chairs a bit closer to the door. But I think we're getting a bit of a through breeze, which is good. So we have some time to go into this topic, which is really vitally important as the UK and the world look at the net zero ambitions. We put this event together because the Centre for Science and Policy, along with other parts of Cambridge University, have done some work on critical minerals. And we're very pleased to be working with Cambridge Zero in putting this session together. So I think both Emily, as Director of Cambridge Zero, is here. Emily Shipra is there at the back, as well as Harriet Hunnable, who runs the Policy Forum for Cambridge Zero. So this is the pan-university network, which brings together so many parts of the university, all doing parts of the research and knowledge exchange necessary for the UK and global net zero transition. So once we reflected on a policy workshop we'd done on critical minerals last year, we reached out to some of our partners in government, including Department for Business and Trade, who I know are coming up to the publication of a new critical minerals updated strategy. So we look forward to kind of sharing input that might contribute to that. Today, what we're going to do is run in order with some scene setting from the UK Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, where we have Pierre Josso, the Deputy Director, who's going to put some of the introductory material out there for you to reflect on. And then I will introduce the other speakers in turn after that. And I think what we'll do is we'll probably go through and then have the discussion and the Q&A at the end, unless there's anything that's sort of unclear in somebody's talk initially. So perhaps, first of all, if I ask Pierre he's going to speak. We're going to stay seated because this helps us with the microphone. And Pierre is a geoscientist where he improves our understanding of critical minerals supply chains at the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, has a specialisation in mineral exploration, and he has worked on both machine learning algorithms for prospectivity analysis and characterising the resource and environmental impact of deep-sea mineral extractive activities. So, Pierre, I think you're going to tell us about this updated criticality assessment for the UK and give us a little bit of a scene setting for the next 30 years.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, still morning. So I've just set up a few slides. Probably a lot of you will be very familiar with the topic if you've been following the subject of critical minerals for the few months / years, potentially for some of you. But importantly, the BGS, which hosts the CMIC, has been working on critical metals for the past 15, 20 years already. And we're now seeing this topic being picked up as the geopolitics of the world is really putting strain on our supply chain. So, clearly not going the right way. Excellent. So why are minerals so important in our everyday life? I realise the panel might not see very much what's happening there. But effectively, down there for you guys. While we're seeing the big trends that drives mineral commodities are really an increase in our general population overall, improving standards of living for most of the population. Our energy transition is driving also a major shift in the way we use materials effectively to produce energy and transport it to the centers of consumption. And effectively, we're seeing an improvement into the quality of all the materials and improvement in their complexity, be it in electricity, electronics, constructions, and so on. So effectively, this is a nice little neat diagram that shows how much overall, this is for a typical American person, but about 1.4 million kilograms of minerals will be used per person, per American, when they were born. So this is giving you a scale of what we use, and whilst mostly none of us are very aware of those minerals because we use them in our services, in our object manufactured goods every day, we don't really connect as much with the mining side of this. Compared to agricultural products, we need to eat, drink 2-3 times a day. Most of the time we feel very disconnected to the mineral side of the story. So, as I said, over the last 200-300 years, society has evolved drastically. We've moved away from key metals from the Industrial Revolution to now using nearly most of the elements which are present into the periodic table of elements. And this top right figure just show you the elements which are used nowadays in a little instruments that most of you will have in your pockets, which is your mobile phone. And effectively, the tremendous diversification in energy and IT infrastructure rests on us unlocking the capacity, the physical, chemical, magnetic properties of some of those elements to improve our way of life. And effectively, a big challenge for us nowadays, as we're seeing becoming more and more aware of the footprint of mining on land and generating resources from dredging the seafloor for aggregates and others, we're seeing more and more an environmental responsibility feeling as we want to be able to produce those mineral resources sustainably. And nowadays, we see that mineral production may come from conflict zone where we have human rights abuse, exploitation of children's. And effectively, we're trying to improve the environmental, social, and governance standard around production of minerals, but this also takes us further away from the cheapest option. And at the end of the day, the consumer pays the price of the product. So responsible consuming comes with a cost. Effectively, when we talk about critical mineral, what's important to remember is that this is not a geological limit on our availability of the materials that we have around us. It is economic and geopolitical. So effectively, as I said, the risk to supply is mostly coming from the concentration of the production, not only at the mining stage or the processing stage, how we extract the rock and transform it into a metal, but we also explore how the concentration carries on all the way through the manufactured product, be it at the transformation into a subcomponent, how those components are integrated into larger products, which makes it into a final product. So we see that a lot of the time, critical mineral, the focus is on the concentration of mining or refining. China is quite often cited as the big elephant in the room, concentrating 70% of the refining of metals worldwide. But this goes much further, whereby sometimes one industry may control the production of one single component over which a whole industry may be reliant on. And effectively, this can now be used as geopolitical leverage by various entities, be it a company or a nation, which if is not aligned with your own interest, you will consider your supply chain at risk. And this is what's really driving the notion of criticality. And as I said, effectively, this is just an example of the work CMIC and a lot of other institutes are doing, is effectively understanding the whole supply chain and transformation of products from ores to metals to components into our everyday product, understanding where the bottlenecks might be and where stress might come from in case of a disruption. And this is how we came around defining the latest update on the criticality assessment that was published last year, whereby we looked at the global supply risk, exploring a range of indicators of production concentration, trade concentration, substitutability, how much we can recycle and effectively get a second source for those metals rather than the primary supply. And we explored how much a disruption in this supply risk would have an impact on the UK economy and its various industrial sectors. So we've defined 34 raw materials. Not all of them are minerals, but effectively they encapsulate all the different product stage as well and transformation through the supply chain. So all those critical minerals are those that sit above that criticality thresholds, and effectively they are deemed the most important for the UK economy going forward. But it's important to consider that this is a snapshot in time. We're relying on existing data and effectively looking forward in time. Doing foresight analysis is extremely complicated, as we can very rarely anticipate all the parameters that will drive technological evolution. We've done some work on this. I know Sam has done a lot of work on this as well. We'll probably talk about how we anticipate mineral consumption increasing into the future. But whether we also manage to increase proportionally our supply doesn't necessarily mean that the supply will still be stable despite very big, scary numbers potentially coming out of those projections. It's not true for all of them. Some are very scary. So what's the way forward? So effectively, as Nicky said, we're still waiting for the release of the latest update on the critical mineral strategy from colleagues at DBT. But some of the main points of improvement is obviously diversification of our supply chain, whether that take the form of increasing our domestic supply, valorizing the deposits and industries that we may have, encouraging recovery of end-of-life products and favorizing the development of recycling industries, or improving our relationship with our different international partners, which are the main producers for a metal, for a product, is actually key for de-risking our risk of supply disruption and effectively sustaining our industrial sectors. And effectively for this, it's absolutely essential to be forward-looking, as we know that the emerging technologies and energies of today's are going to be the one that are going to be driving the society in the next 10, 20, 50 years, and anticipating what minerals, materials may be required, as much as the skills of the people working in those sectors are going to be, is paramount for preparing for the future. I think that's it.
Great.
Effectively.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass to our next speaker, Niva Thirachelvam, who's been a CSaP policy fellow and a good friend to CSaP, joined Hecla in 2022 and previously had a number of jobs across Whitehall, including Deputy Director for Net Zero and HM Treasury. And I think Niva had, again, some big picture thoughts on critical minerals and the transition to net zero.
Thanks, Nicky. Wow, how to follow Pierre. I'm going to speak about some of the trends that we're seeing, and this is based on primarily my experience at Hecla, where we talk to investors, global investors, about how they deploy capital and what they're facing and how they kind of navigate some of the forces that they face. So what investors are looking for, the geopolitics and politics that they need to navigate, which will affect the choices available to them. And then I'll end on an optimistic note about what may come as a result of all of this. So starting with investors, what do they look for? So they prefer focused, very high quality assets, so rather than diversified mining assets. So when we're talking about the net zero, we've been talking about it for many years. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of advice. They hoover all of that up and they work out where they want to globally put their money to work. We've picked up sceptical increasingly of M&A and greenfield projects, and that's just because in their experience over the past kind of decade or so, the mining industry's track record in this area hasn't been great in terms of delivering these projects to time and to timetable. And so they prefer, pure critical mineral plays rather than projects which look at a range of different minerals. They're responsive to what governments and governments across the world and politicians are saying. And so in terms of global capital flows, they're moving away from bulk commodities like coal and iron ore for obvious reasons, because there's a decline in demand for them. Interestingly, in recent years, they're also being much more sceptical about lithium, which they see as oversupplied. They're worried about Chinese dominance in this area and Chinese dominance depressing prices. And finally, they are favouring things like copper, which will work in any world. It works now. There's a strong demand outlook because it will also work in a world where there's mass electrification and demand from AI infrastructure. And so these are some of the mega trends that we're seeing in terms of investors. What do they therefore want from policymakers, from governments around the world? To state the obvious, they want policy certainty. This allows them to price their investments, work out their rate of return, and work out whether or not they're willing to deploy their capital in that way, or whether they look at a different type of asset or different type of industry altogether. And without this policy certainty, they will avoid assets altogether. And I've had conversations with huge global investors where they have said, I'd love to invest in this. It's just very uncertain, so I'm not going to look at it. To draw out kind of a recent example in a totally different sphere, Trump and his tariffs policy. he made those announcements, we were kind of inundated with questions about what it doesn't mean, what's he going to do. He then U-turns, creates more uncertainty. And we've seen a huge number of investors just move away from the US altogether. And Europe is suddenly looking much more attractive. And that is where policy certainty plays a really important role in the way in which investors think about things. And the current kind of very live debate about net zero, not just in the UK, but also kind of in other major economies, plays into this with investors thinking about whether or not there is that political commitment, whether there is that political consensus that will give them that long-term certainty that they need for projects of this nature. Because we're not talking about a, 5 to 7 year sort of private equity type time frame. We're talking about 10, 20, 30 years. And many investors, therefore, are looking at that and wondering whether or not they need to take a different view on the pace of the transition and whether or not they stay with some of their existing assets rather than moving to support the energy transition. So this is a nice segue into geopolitics and politics. It's what affects politicians' ability to provide this long-term certainty over the horizons that investors would like to see. The main thing to point out, which all of you will know, is whoever's kind of dominant in the net zero age will come out. Whoever's kind of on top will be dominant economically in the net zero age. And that's driven this race for critical minerals. We have seen China, build partnerships, invest heavily globally. And therefore, governments are treating critical minerals as national security assets. We're seeing defence and intelligence agencies shaping investment decisions and R&D strategies internally within government, which is something that is a newer trend. It wasn't the case so much, I would say, 5 or 10 years ago. And mining firms are increasingly having to align with national security goals in order to access funding for some of these projects or avoid regulatory barriers when they're thinking about how to start up a project and continue it. And as a result, because of this shift to this national security prism, states are increasingly moving to bilateral frameworks in order to, and avoiding multilateral mechanisms, because this is seen as a race. This is seen as nation first rather than working with others to support the transition. And yes, we do have things like the Mineral Security Partnership, which aims to try and mitigate some of this zero-sum competition amongst allies. But you're still seeing amongst many of the Western economies, which are driving a lot of this, bilateral pursuits of critical minerals. Perhaps the biggest macro trend in all of this is the dynamic between the US and China. China's dominance in mineral processing, so this is, I think, 70% of global production, has become a real strategic vulnerability for Western economies. Governments are thinking about this, talking about it. It affects the way, therefore, in which mining companies and investors are thinking and talking about how which projects they decide to take up, where they might invest. And we pick this up in terms of the way in which the US and the EU are shaping their policy frameworks and the choices that they're making about the supply chain, worrying about an over-reliance on Chinese supply chains, particularly given, over the past few years, the US, legislated for the Inflation Reduction Act, the National Defense Production Act, aiming to localize supply chains and reduce exposure to China, and China retaliated with kind of trade measures and export restrictions. So this is a real kind of dynamic, live situation in which people are having to take decisions about huge amounts of money, and so it necessarily kind of affects the way in which they think about that. And so we're seeing not just the US, but the EU as well, pursuing independent strategies, but also private sector players. So big tech companies like Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, they're all dictating the security of domestic supply chains, particularly for data centers, which then affects the way in which the market is sort of carved up effectively between big nations. Central Asian and Balkan states, rich in critical minerals, are becoming real focal points for US and EU engagement. You saw this with the way in which Trump talked about peace in Ukraine. He was, laser-like focused on the critical minerals that Ukraine has. And therefore, geopolitical tensions in that region, particularly with Russia, will play a role. And this is why it becomes quite a messy picture for investors and kind of mining companies to navigate. They could look elsewhere to emerging economies, but the trends that we're picking up in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia are that they're asserting greater control over their strategic assets. They're not looking to do deals as much. We're seeing a trend towards nationalisation, renegotiating contracts to favour the state, and really kind of leveraging their infrastructure to support this. And so in a world where there is this race, people are being much more protectionist. They are kind of carving up markets and using private sector actors as well to support this strategy. They're also having to manage the domestic politics of this. And there's a real dissonance between the support for net zero and the transition and civil kind of opposition to the extractive industries, which for me doesn't quite make sense because you need one to support the other. And I appreciate mining companies have had, quite a dirty history. They haven't considered the impacts on local communities and kind of provided that sort of support and compensation. But you do need to apply that pressure on them so that they do that while supporting them. And that's where there are kind of blockages. And again, this affects the private sector, the appeal to the private sector, and the degree to which they think that a project is doable or not. And that then means you're increasing transition costs, you're slowing the pace of the transition, and companies are sticking, and investors are sticking with the status quo a bit more and for longer than they otherwise would have. I'll move to the light at the end of the tunnel. I am an optimist, so yes, I do think this is more of a blip at the moment. We will see higher costs, but that's only if you stick with that quite linear transition in a world where we think we know what the technologies are and we're going to stick with them for the next 25 years. But the world is a dynamic place. Technologies change all the time. And the three kind of glimmers of hope that I'll leave you with are we're seeing huge advances in mineral recycling, which therefore reduces our reliance on mining. We're seeing synthetic alternatives, which I know are reshaping supply chains and reducing geopolitical risk. I was talking to a chief exec of a huge kind of US data center company a couple of weeks ago, and they're looking at synthetics, partly because of US-China dynamics, but also because it's more sustainable. And that's affecting the way in which they're thinking about what to invest in, how to kind of progress their business. And then finally, ESG standards. ESG was, flavor of the month many moons ago. It's kind of reappearing in different guises with different names, but it is being used increasingly as a gatekeeping tool in order to hold mining companies to account, in order to kind of prevent non-compliant players from acting in kind of Western markets, and really reinforcing kind of good actors based on kind of transparency and sustainability.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's great to hear the investor's perspective, the implications for politics, and those kind of foresight insights for the future. So next I'm going to hand on to Dr. Stan Stevenson, who's a research associate in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge, working as part of the Climate Compatible Growth Research Project, amongst others. I invite you to tell us a bit about the research you've been involved in on supply chains and critical minerals.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do I like to move that? If you can't hear, okay. That man's got his thumbs up, that's great, thank you. So our research project called Climate Compatible Growth tries to sit at the intersection of working out what the UK needs to do to meet its own decarbonisation kind of needs and objectives and the global impacts and the global kind of decarbonisation agenda, particularly focused around these countries in the global south that house the majority of the critical minerals that we need to dig out of the ground over the next 25 years. And so the few points I'm going to try and make are going to try and straddle these two kind of key areas, the UK perspective and then the global south or global perspective more generally. And the place where we've started thinking about this is to really understand what are the demands for critical minerals in the UK. And we're not the only people doing this. There's lots of kind of various approaches to try and map the pathways to net zero and their implications for different critical minerals. One of the things that we've found, and I guess the key takeaway from that is, as Pierre pointed to at the start, there's a huge amount of uncertainty over that final number, depending on the technology choices, depending on the pathways that we take. But actually, there's a huge amount of agency that the government has in determining that final number as well, depending on the choice of pathway that they make. We've been modeling different approaches based around a kind of maybe what you might consider a like-for-like transformation of everyone moving to an electric vehicle, of everyone kind of living in the same housing types and that sort of thing, and seeing a rapid increase in the amount of critical minerals required over the next 20 to 30 years, and comparing that against what you might consider a kind of a low energy demand transition, which we found can reduce the total material consumption by about 40 to 45%. Based on our final requirements in 2050. And what's interesting here is that while 5 years ago, around the time of kind of these pathways becoming in vogue, these low energy demand pathways were seen as kind of very unattractive. People didn't like the idea of them. They were heralded this kind of idea of, oh, you're going to be taking away people's cars or taking away people's ability to do stuff and their freedoms, which has some validity to it. I'm not dispelling that. But now is being reframed in the light of these questions around security of supply, of meeting that demand, and on the background of a kind of a global supply chain that's very heavily dependent on China, as has been mentioned several times. Actually, these alternative pathways could be a pathway to improving our resilience, improving both our energy resilience, but also our economic resilience against the kind of barriers or tariffs or these sorts of kind of economic and geopolitical tactics that have been used in recent years. And so actually something that was considered very out of vogue only kind of a year or two ago is now being reframed in the light of a way of improving resilience and improving our economic security at the same time. One of the other things that we found that I also wanted to touch on that I don't think has been kind of talked about as much is the critical materials that are currently very much in demand that are going to be in less demand, I guess. Our demand for these things are going to reduce, including things like palladium, platinum, in the energy and decarbonisation space, primarily used in these fossil fuel technologies. So at the moment, they're very heavily used in catalytic converters. And as we move away from these, as we move away from petrol and diesel cars, we are going to have this kind of like dearth of these materials that still have value in other spaces, particularly in aerospace, defense, all these other sectors, and kind of a domestic supply sat in these old vehicles that are reaching the end of their life over the next kind of 10, 15 years that we have the opportunity to harvest and develop. And so actually understanding the pathways of which we take forward opens up new avenues to harvest these resources, extract these resources, and then deploy them in kind of other geopolitically or domestically political areas and important. But we have to understand kind of when these things are going to become available and kind of what their uses are over time in order to then kind of put in place the policies and pathways and agendas to then say, all right, we're not going to ship these old cars off to the global south or just put them in a scrapyard, but we're actually going to put in place the businesses and the support to actually then harvest these materials and deploy them in new and politically kind of like important or advantageous ways. And then I wanted to then kind of do an abrupt switch to the global side of you, excuse me, and just make, I think, one point which we found that I think is really important that hasn't really got enough attention. And that is around, when we've been understanding these supply chains, the lens and approach through which you understand them. And so we've talked a lot at the moment about the role that China plays in our supply chains and kind of the risk that poses to our economic agenda, but also in particular our decarbonisation agenda if they cut off the extraction of raw materials. And that is a very true thing. That's absolutely valid and holds particularly true when you look at it at the level of what country house the different things. The work that we've been doing looks in much more detail at the company level supply chains and trade routes through which the critical minerals through which critical move into the final products. And when you look at it at the companies, you find much more kind of nuanced and interesting insights, which I think policymakers also need to take into account. And so the two things I think to bear in mind here is that while China is very dominant as a country in these sorts of situations, there is a huge number of companies in China trying to do this work. And so you might have 10, 15, 20 different companies all doing the refining of rare earth minerals or making the anodes and the cathodes that go into lithium-ion batteries. And so if the country wants to cut off its exports, as we've seen in recent months over the rare earths, that's a very real and valid concern. But actually what they do have within the country is this huge amount of resilience to individual company level or even regional level shocks, and particularly climate shocks, which they're very good at overcoming because they've created this market of a huge amount of dynamism, a huge amount of resiliency within these sectors which they've tried to foster. If you compare that to some of the other countries that we talk about less, but where they're very dominant in the mining or kind of the first order stages before you get to the processing of the materials, there you find these very large, typically kind of Western Anglo companies that are huge in these spaces and don't allow in any new players, any new competitors, and don't really have this same sense of dynamism. And so in our analysis of the lithium supply chain, while a huge amount of the processing is done in China, all of the mining and all of the harvesting is done by two companies in two countries, Chile and Australia. And so if one of these companies is impacted by a financial disaster and goes bankrupt, that is half your lithium supply chain gone. Or alternatively, if there's an avalanche or a natural disaster in one of these countries, likewise, you still see a halving of your supply chain, which we think is kind of much less talked about when we look at the company aspects of that. And so that's one of the things we've been really trying to push. I'm going to stop there because I think I've talked for too long, but thank you. That's
great. We look forward to accessing more of your knowledge through the questions and answers as well. So finally, I'm going to introduce Deepesh Jayasakara, who's...
okay if I use the podium?
Yeah, and there's no microphone.
That's all right. I think my voice was loud enough.
Moving at all.
But the mouse is appearing on there, so if you think it's got a second monitor.
Oh, you're on two screens.
Yeah, let me do it. Okay, I got it. All right.
Perfect. So Deepesh is working at the Institute for Manufacturing, and I think you would tell us about the UK-India Critical Minerals Observatory as well as other things. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm really happy to be here at the Royal Society on this conference by CSaP. First of all, I'm Dr. Deepesh Jayasakara, and I work for Institute for Manufacturing. And I think the panelists have laid a very good foundation on critical minerals and the complexity of the problem. But here, since we had a lot of discussion about this topic, let's see some action, right? Because we are already nearing the launch. So I'm sure, so it's good to have a little bit of action. So I will bring some of the metrics and some of the demos that we have developed through one of our projects. So I'm working with a research group called Industrial Resilience Research Group. So the chap over to your right, Dr. Mukesh Kumar, over to your left, was supposed to be here, and he was the head of the group. And yesterday night, if Nicky can vouch for me, he called me and said, I'm unable to come, so please, Deepesh, go ahead today. There's a conference at Royal Society, can you please present? So here I am. So, yeah. So we are a multidisciplinary group of people coming from engineering, manufacturing, from computer science, from data science, from policy, from supply chain, and all of the things. The thing is, the problem we're tackling today needs this multidisciplinary approach. So this is one of the key frameworks that we are using in tackling the resilience problems in critical mineral supply chains. And believe me or not, we academics are sometimes very slow. So the head of the group took like 10 years to come up with that, those small circles. But now it has turned out to be one of the very effective tools to framing this whole critical minerals resilience project. So just to give a brief introduction about it, what we are going to talk about here is that when external events are associating or when they are interacting with the vulnerabilities in the systems, and these systems can be supply chains, these systems can be factories, these systems can be anything, and that lead to a risk. And when these risks are not mitigated in real time or not proactively, that leads to the disruption of that system. So what we're trying to do in this research of resilience is trying to instill this risk mitigation within the system proactively so that these systems won't disrupt or fail. So that leads to resilience. And here we are going to focus on three very important things in ensuring resilience, which is the product, process, and location. And you will get to know why this is important. So I think this is a very good picture to explain one of the most challenging issues in modern critical mineral supply chains. So if you look at this, this is a person driving in a thick fog in one of the motorways in the UK, and you can see the visibility is not very much, right? So what happens when you don't have enough visibility is that you don't know what's coming ahead, right? That leads to accidents and eventually catastrophic failures or likely to death or all these disasters. So this is very similar to modern day supply chains, right? These supply chains are very dynamic, running at a rapid pace, but they don't see what's coming ahead. So we were talking to one of the OEMs in automotive a couple of days ago in the UK, and they said the visibility they have in the supply chain, would you like to take a guess as a percentage?
50%.
Little lower. What do you think?
30.
No. They said, okay, a little bit positive. I think they said their visibility is 10%. This is one of the major automotive manufacturers in the UK. I don't want to name the names, but that is the issue they are facing. So they want us, researchers, academics, policymakers, to collaboratively try to tackle this problem. So you can see the issue here, right? So these are the tiers in the supply chain. But most OEMs, they have visibility on only up to like tier 1 and 2. But everything else, they don't have visibility at all. And some of these tiers can go down to like 8 or 9. And the other problem is there are supply chains called gray supply chains, which are not monitored, which are not audited, which are in midst of these deeper tiers. And the companies have no visibility. So this is the issue faced in most of these companies. So as a result, all of these headlines are evident from all these news articles. You can see all the issues, right? I won't go too much into detail here because I need to come to the action stage. So, and this is a very important slide because as you can see, a lot of regulations are coming up. For example, one of the very widely known Scope 3 emission, CSaP, all these emissions are, all these policies are coming up and regulations are coming up, and therefore all the actors in the supply chains need to comply, right? Therefore, understanding and visibility of the supply chain is very important. But the next question is how to ensure that visibility, and that is through data. So when we went and access the data, try to understand what is available, and this is the problem. This is one of the Nature articles recently published showcasing the issue with the data, right? Some of the data is not complete, some of the data we can't access, they are behind paywall, and some of these data may have gaps, and we may not even know whether the accuracy of the data, which is a challenging situation. So, so we thought, why not try to address these complex problems, taking a very complex approach. So we tried to learn from our colleagues right next door in Cambridge in astronomy department. So we decided, we asked this question, how do they look at things that they can't see, right? So astronomy, they might use different tools. They might use a telescope, and they might use an advanced telescope if they want more granularity. And if they want even more granular and more accurate data, they might send even a satellite or a rover. But the problem is, each of these steps is associated with the cost, right? So the accuracy of the data level that you want to go will depend on that cost and this trade-off. So we try to employ that concept of astronomy here to develop a global supply chain observatory for critical minerals. And here we are defining three important dimensions: visibility, traceability, and transparency. And we believe this is essential to ensure resilience in critical minerals. So these are the group of people working on this project. Our technology partner is Google Cloud, which are very helpful in providing us access to all the Google Cloud tools and services. And we are also working in this project with the IIT Bombay and ISR Pune in India, because at the end of the day, this project was commissioned by DSIT from UK and also supported by Indian government to help Ukraine and India come to an understanding of their critical minerals and how the two countries can work together to solve some of these problems. So these are some of the objectives. I won't go into detail, but we wanted to understand was to explore the data and understand what is currently available. What can the open data tell you, right? First, we have to explore what is available. And then to make some recommendations to supply chain fortification and come up with some solutions. That is very important. So we are not purely trying to do only research, but we're trying to convert that research into a product or a service to make a real impact. And then to accelerate investments in either countries, and finally to improve skills and capacity augmentation and knowledge dissemination. So I think this gentleman, the panel laid out a very good understanding or a good picture of critical minerals are. And we are only looking into this project for 5 critical minerals, focusing on the first 2 main products. That is solar PV manufacturing and EV battery manufacturing. Specifically, we are looking into lithium, cobalt, graphite, and indium and tellurium from solar. So this is the framework that we have employed. As you can see, we are using the foundation principles of data identification, data definition, and then data collection, monitoring, analysis, interpretation, and final knowledge sharing. And we are looking into multiple products. At the first stage, we look into EV batteries and solar. And we are employing some of these capabilities such as transparency and sustainability, tracking, monitoring, resilience and stress testing, as well as visibility and identifying those blind spots. And at the end of the day, we are trying to encapsulate all these things into an accessible platform for anyone, for policymakers, for industry, for academics to use this as a digital data infrastructure to understand the complexity of critical mineral supply chains. So, all right, the talks are enough. Now let's get into some of the action. So, so this is a project between Ukraine and India. What we are trying to do is trying to establish the largest digital data infrastructure on critical minerals. So we are looking into end-to-end supply chain, starting from resources, mining, processing, component manufacturing to recycling. And we have diverse data sets, not just 1 or 2, but we have around 72 different sources and looking at around 4,000 data points. So you can see some of this data overlaid on Google Earth Engine. You can see where the facilities are, and then we then map these nodes using trade data, UN Comtrade data specifically, to see these relationships. And you can see some of the problems, right? So here you can see UK is the largest exporter of cobalt to India, but UK has no cobalt manufacturing or processing, right? So then how does that happen? Is the data accurate? So what we found out was that the paper trail is the data, it's not the material flow. But we can't ensure the resilience in supply chain without the material flow. And then you can see we overlay like different data sets on top of each other to understand the complexity of the problem. Here what we are trying to do is using Landsat as well as Sentinel satellite data to understand the emissions in different supply chain actors. So we can monitor these things without even asking for them because these are open data. And you can see the vegetation deforestation, and you can access this data through the platform. You can download them. If you are a researcher, you can use this data in your research. Then we use this data to understand the impact on the water bodies, understand the impact on the soil and all these things. So this is a very important one. You can see very poor living conditions right next to a mine, and there's a golf course inside the mine, which leads to social issues that we are seeing in modern supply chains. And then you can see some of the clever works that our guys are doing on simulation and modeling. So we are developing a platform like this where you can identify where these locations are, because understanding the location is very important to understand the visibility of these different supply chain actors. Right? So here's an example in the solar PV manufacturing. So you can see at various supply chain stages, some of the manufacturing of components are concentrated in one part of the world, and some are not, right? So this leads to vulnerabilities in their own supply chains. And you can click on these different dots and identify the data points. So we are, as I said earlier, we're looking at around 4,000 different data points here. And then we are developing different demand forecasting models at the same time by combining some of the existing ones. And let me tell you, there are so many at the moment, right? So what we're trying to do is to give transparency to everyone. So these are the models that are there, and if you use this model, and this will be the output, so you can test for yourself. And the traceability is the other very important thing. So here we are tracing back lithium carbonate that is coming to India, and you can see it is very distributed. So you can see a lot of action happening in the Europe, right? But the end mineral, or the mineral ore, is coming from Chile and Argentina, right? And you will see very interesting things in a little bit. So now we are trying to understand the amount, the content, or the volume of this trade data. And you can see Ireland is exporting a large amount of lithium carbonate to India, but Ireland is not importing the same amount of lithium carbonate to Ireland. So Ireland has no mines of lithium or processing, so how can they do it? So is the data accurate once again? We don't know at the moment. We are still exploring. Okay? So this shows the issue that these guys were talking, the concentration of some of these supply chains in China and in some part of the world. And moving forward, we are linking port-to-port data, vessel data using AIS data sets to understand real-time moving of vessels and how to track these minerals from mines to the end product. And also we are developing tools. So let's say we don't have access to data. So what can you do, right? So we are using Google Earth Engine and satellite data to create our own data sets. So it's one of the tools we have developed to create a fingerprint of the emission of certain supply chain actors. And if you know the fingerprint and run it across the world, we don't need to know the location of those actors, we can find it. And we can use again satellite data and go deep down, zoom in and see whether there's an actual mine or actual manufacturing facility. So we are working with a large number of stakeholders in this. We are working with mining companies, we're working with manufacturers, we're working with both UK and India government on this project. So at the end of the day, you will have access to a platform as I just showed you, where you can access this data, where you can use this data to do your own research activities, and also the policymakers can use this platform to answer some of the questions. And the interesting part is this type of project hasn't been attempted before. So this is the first time that we are doing it. We are not saying this is the only way to do it, but this is one of the approaches as researchers that we are trying to tackle this problem. So using AI, we are trying to automate some of the processes. We are using Gemini and Vertex AI from Google Cloud as they are one of our technology partners. And I'm telling you, we've achieved some of the things that we will be releasing in the coming months. For example, especially when it comes to data extraction, because some of this data is not even in a digital format, right? Even if you talk to our colleagues in BGS, and Gavin Mudd also visited us and told us, like, some of this data is still in paper format. So how can we access them, right? So we can use AI tools at the moment that are available to do this. And we've developed some of the capabilities which shows around 80% of success to extract this data, because these are very unstructured data. They are not in one format. They are not in one table format. So extracting is really difficult. And therefore, we're working on it. So that's it. What I want to tell you is this is not a problem that only we can solve. So that's why you can see a lot of actors are working with us, stakeholders working with us to solve this. So my invitation is all of you guys, if you're interested, to reach out to us and work with us to solve this very critical problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give some time now for questions. If anybody has anything in the audience, and it would be good to speak into the microphone. I could start off by asking Deepesh then, how do you see this being important for the ESG aspects of extraction? If we have more of this kind of data visualized, how do you think investors would draw on this to understand
It is very important, because even I wouldn't name the names, but even like big mining companies, they don't know the ESG impact, mainly the environmental impact on their own mines. So one of the companies have reached out to us asking the same question, can you do this based on the tools you have developed? For example, using geospatial analysis with the satellite data, we can do the greenhouse gas emission analysis, the fingerprinting, and all these things to help them understand this is your fingerprint of environment, like the carbon emissions, not only in the mine, but across the supply chain. So if they are willing to share the data, for example, there's like suppliers, and we can expand this work significantly, because what you saw just now is purely based on open data, not integrated with the company at the moment. But now we can see the second phase. A lot of companies are interested. They are working with us. For example, the second phase, one of the mining companies in India are already funding this project because they want to understand the REE ecosystem as a whole. What they're saying is they might have manufacturing capability, but without knowing the demand or the actors within the ecosystem, they can't do any strategy. They can't make any strategic decisions. So a tool like this will significantly help them to make those decisions.
Very good. So Harriet first, maybe, and then Alex on the same row.
Thank you very much. Really interesting panel presentations, and I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. Neva, a question for you, but perhaps others could discuss it as well. You spoke very clearly about some of the risks aligned with interest from investors. How are they actually seeing the investment as a positive opportunity in terms of comparable areas? And we now know what rare earths are, and the concept has got as far as Trump. But that opportunity, how can you kind of give us a sense, the context of that opportunity, please?
Do you want to come straight back on that one, and then I'll take Alex's? Yeah.
So they are very, very optimistic about the opportunity. It's the reason they're asking the question, which is always a good start. They are very, I would say, two things. One, they are very sensitive to the political debate globally. And so when there was a great kind of momentum behind net zero, it is all that they would talk about. I saw this when I was in the Treasury, leading on this work in the UK government, but also in my current role. Huge enthusiasm for it. They wanted information. They wanted data. They wanted to understand what are the frameworks that governments will put in place that will allow them to quantify risk and put it through their kind of models and understand what the costs are likely to be, the economic costs as well as the kind of the financial returns. What I have seen more recently is just a slowing down of that. And it may be a short-term slowdown, responding to big global players like the US suddenly withdrawing slightly. It may be more of a medium-term slowdown as they realise, actually, this isn't going to go as quickly as they had hoped because there are some domestic challenges. And that's where, I was really struck by Dipesh's anecdote about a golf course within a mining complex in a deprived community. And that's where having information from the outset about the project at a local level, but also the frameworks that governments might have and the understanding the geopolitical kind of dynamics helps investors to kind of take a more informed decision. And it's not that they won't, it's that we need to kind of equip them with information to allow them to do it with confidence, but also we need to address some of these issues so that the political debate changes slightly, which makes it a much easier decision to take.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for the panel. Really, really interesting. I just wanted to ask a question on something that wasn't really covered in this. In terms of deep sea mining, I kind of had two questions. One was almost a devil's advocate point of, with mining having such an impact on land ecosystems and much of the minerals still left being in pristine ecosystems that are now even more precious, is there kind of more of an impetus to actually go to deep sea mining, where we have a lot more completely untouched areas and preserve what we still have on land? And my second question was about, with mining being a more protectionist kind of way forwards, is there any incentive if countries are taking unilateral decisions to start deep sea mining, i.e. in the case of America at the moment, is there any incentives for the rest of the world to then not exploit and start to explore deep sea mining and kind of continue the abstinence from it at the moment?
Did you want to start with that one, Pierre, and then see if anyone else?
So, well, effectively, deep sea mining is quite a controversial topic. And from an environmental perspective, time and time again, people have asked me, how do you compare environmental impact from terrestrial mining to that of the extraction of seafloor massive sulfide nodules or crusts? And effectively, it's comparing apples and oranges. Those are completely two different environments. They provide different ecosystem services. They will have different impact. Mining, any human activity will have an impact. It's effectively how far we are willing to go in accepting the impact to get what we need out of the environment, because at the end of the day, we need to extract those material from somewhere. It's effectively weighing the pros and cons of producing nickel either from Indonesian forests, cobalt and copper from the DRC, or other areas versus exploiting effectively what some people call a new frontier, potentially for minerals. And yes, there are lots of pros and cons, and yes, there is no human living there, so effectively social impact might be very different. Yes, the biodiversity metrics are very different to that of a rainforest, but it doesn't mean those ecosystems shouldn't be protected. So we are still in a process feeding information to the International Seabed Authority, sitting under the UN bodies, to be able to take the best decision as to whether this environment, at least in the high seas, are worth going for and exploring, and potentially doing so with the best protection that we can put in place. So effectively setting up the rules for industry impact monitoring and remediation before the industry actually starts would be a gigantic plus compared to the history of that extractive industry. As to the geopolitical implication, that's very much the high seas, but every nation is free to do whatever they want within their exclusive economic zone. And at the moment, we know about 13 different nations which are actively exploring within their exclusive economic zone. And we know that China is very strongly positioning itself. It's the most active in high seas as well as in the South China Sea, which is a new focal point for geopolitical tension, for high resources in oil and gas, as well as deep sea mineral resources. The way Trump has gone about it is a very surprising move, not surprising for him, but effectively the way the international community is reacting to that is even more so pushing against him and isolating it in terms of this drive for America first, bypassing completely any UN discussion as well as the international community and the consensus on this. So effectively, there is a lot of pressure on whoever the first mover will be to actually start deep sea mining for potentially, if it ever happens, to do it right so that it can set up the standard. But effectively rushing it through an outdated mining code is not the way forward.
Does anyone else want to come in on anything with that?
I think one of the major drivers of this is the demand. So if you look at some of these minerals, the demand is staggering. For example, if I asked you to guess the lithium demand in the next 40 years, what would you say? How many times of today's demand?
40.
40?
42. 42 times. That's significantly more than anyone expected. And same goes to cobalt, which is like 21 times. So that is one of the major drivers, which makes countries explore different ways of identify the resources or the reserves.
What's really interesting, and what joins back effectively to what I was saying about the difficulty of projecting forward and the perceived risk, is that effectively, despite the fact we may need 40 times in the next 20 years the lithium that we currently need, we know that with the massive drive in the boom in lithium exploration that has happened, we know now of about 120 years worth of reserve currently, and effectively this is why the price of lithium is slumping completely, because we are oversupplied. Same for cobalt, where we've seen as well a diversification in the battery chemistry away from cobalt-rich batteries, shifting towards higher content in nickel or potentially lithium iron phosphates. So there are alternatives, and it's moving very fast, so the demand is also shifting very rapidly.
I was just going to make a very kind of brief point about some of the competing tensions in governments across the world where, yes, they are all, barring Trump, in favour of a rules-based order and wanting to therefore approach with caution. But on the other hand, we've seen that there's a huge push around kind of biodiversity and conservation and understanding kind of the limits of growth that has not had a huge political take-up. And so they are very willing, in the pursuit of growth, I would say, to look at how to address some of the concerns and push forward, rather than accept that actually there are some parts of the environment that we want to kind of conserve as it is.
And effectively, it's a very important sticking point into the critical mineral supply chain. Is effectively a lot of people consider the fact that we need to deploy en masse those low carbon technology, decarbonize heavy industry, electrify massively. But that means we need to dig up some rocks. And that will it's effectively accepting this compromise, this conundrum, is that you need to create a local impact to be able to deploy solution to reduce global problems. And effectively, a lot of people, policymakers, are still struggling with that balance, and industries also accepting the real cost in finding the social acceptance. Time and time again, we hear about big projects, big discoveries, but stalling because there is no engagement early enough with the local population to make them understand that, yes, we're going to dig a big hole, but this is to provide you with all the other things that you may need in your life to fulfill your desire to be more environmental, sustainable, and so on. It's this dissonance within the public that needs to be addressed as well.
Is there a question? Go Emily at the back, please. And then,
Thank you. Deepesh, that was a very impressive overview of the work that you're doing. I was interested in everyone's views about how that sort of work ought to be set in a context of the ethical and the geopolitical, national security implications. So on the one hand, you described some aspects in terms of data quality, which is obviously important, but and also some aspects in where this sort of research could be used for, in effect, social good by informing communities who might be implicated by pollution episodes or so forth. But clearly there's also opportunities for bad actors to be using that data in different ways, or to be corrupting the data in different ways. There are potential ethical implications of how that data is gathered, and et cetera. You could think of a whole host of different aspects. So I'm wondering, Deepesh, how your group is thinking about that, but also interested in other people's views about how that sort of research, which is obviously increasingly enabled through AI, which you were touching touching on towards the end there, how we ought to be thinking about framing all of that.
Yeah, so some of one of the main fundamental ideas on data accuracy that we are exploring here is triangulation of data. So we are not relying on one particular data set, but we always rely and cross-reference multiple data sets to ensure the accuracy whenever possible. Sometimes it's not possible when there are no multiple data sources, but whenever possible we do that. But another thing that we're trying to do in our platform is to say that if we know that the accuracy of data is not that high level, then we are going to state the level of accuracy in the data that we present. Because then the policymakers can take some decision with caution from the available data. So having no data is not the answer, right? So have some level of access with some level of accuracy. And again, using the same analogy I used before from astronomy, what we're trying to do is to create some of those rovers by ourselves. For example, in this India-UK project, so we are using one of the companies who are working very closely with the government bodies, the policy think tanks in India, as one of our rovers in India to collect that data for us when it's not possible to gather that data from that source. So because, for example, when dealing with countries like India, the issue once again is that lack of digitalization in the existing data. Because when you go and talk to like Ministry of Mines, they say they have loads of data that has not been used. So how do we access it? That's the problem. So we are using some of those tools that we have developed through this concept to access the data and ensure accuracy of it. But whenever we are not certain, we are definitely giving the uncertainty score for those data sets.
A question here, please, and then
So my question is a bit out there. There's a common theme of an uncertain supply chain with poor visibility. So when you talk about relying on future technology, a lot of this we don't actually know what it's going to look like, is anybody taking space mining seriously?
Elon Musk?
Do you have a perspective on space mining? Yeah.
Yes. So when we talk about space mining, actually, a lot of people think about bringing asteroids back into orbit and exploiting them for their metals. But actually, this is not true. Most of the first step of space mining is actually going to be water. Water for the production of hydrogen and separating it into, hydrogen and oxygen for actually allowing a breathable environment and making rocket fuel. And this is the cost of bringing back asteroids, which are fairly heavy pieces of rocks, into orbit and then bringing them up and down to feed material to Earth is absolutely prohibitive compared to producing those same metal on the planet. And effectively, it's a bit of a science fiction thing that space mining will very much be about providing materials for constructing in space to keep on expanding rather than providing the planet Earth or any other future planet with the material they need.
Did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I asked a follow-up to that.
Thank you. Maybe not mining, but manufacturing in space is quite interesting.
Yes.
Like launch costs are crashing by orders of magnitude. You can make materials purer, crystals purer than you can on Earth. You're already making fiber optic cable on the space station. You might not need rare earth elements in your magnets if you're manufacturing them in space. So just interested in, can we, or a reduced reliance maybe. I'm just interested in, do you think we can innovate our way out of these types of issues?
Well, okay. Effectively, space, by its environment, creates new opportunities for manufacturing, and we are very much in our infancy in discovering some of those and potential new application, and we need to always tailor them to human needs still, which create a lot of prerequisite. As to engineering our way of some of those material needs that we currently have, by experience, is that quite commonly we transpose the problem onto another material. If we want equivalent performance, and either you're ready to put even a higher price and you get equal properties, or otherwise you are not allowed, you have to compromise on the capacity. We have rare earth magnets because they keep their coercion and the magnetic properties at high temperature and high magnetic fields. You can always use a normal magnet, but you're going to have a problem in a few years. So innovation will drive definitely the invention for new material. Potentially we will find solution. I think there's a lot of improvement to be made in how sobriety on the energy need that we need. Effectively, do we really need that much magnets into an engine? Maybe there are ways out of it. Do we need a car that can drive thousands of miles? Maybe not.
Great. Did you have another question here, Harriet? Or should we bring in Charles first?
Thank you. So just continuing on the theme of alternative sources for critical minerals. We've been talking a lot about the supply chain, but not a lot about the end user. Do we need to change our attitude towards critical minerals that we all possess ourselves? You know, we've had a drive in the UK for years towards recycling, but we don't typically hear about recycling of electronic products. Is that a future source or potential source for an investment opportunity, for instance, where you might find higher densities of critical minerals in landfill than you would in mountains?
Is this something your group has looked at, Sam?
Yes, and I guess yes is the short answer to you. There's a huge number of opportunities in this space around kind of the recycling of both kind of our large scale technologies that we use, like kind of as current electric vehicles come to the end of life, but even in things like vapes, which have just tiny amounts of lithium and currently aren't harvested, but also we don't really have technology to go and then extract that. And so that's something where we go back to the innovation question, where there is a huge amount of potential innovation to be done to harvest these kind of things sitting in landfill, but also kind of things that I don't think will be necessarily driven by the market, and therefore is a huge opportunity for policymakers and state actors to come in and set the direction of future action in line with the kind of wider plethora of kind of concerns that we have, whether it's resilience we've been talking about or geopolitical concerns over where we're getting it from. And I think that's going to be the driver to unlock the kind of recycling opportunities that come from it and keeping things domestic rather than kind of, I guess, investment opportunities. That's a key kind of policymaker action that I would call on them to do.
Great. I think, did you want to just...
I just wanted to add a few things to that. Effectively, there's already some very successful examples of recycling. In the UK, we have the largest platinum group metal recycler in the world, Johnson Matthey, which is producing 40% of the supply from effectively using the catalyst converters in cars. So effectively, we already have some of those industry which are in place. We are seeing the creation of a nascent lithium battery recycling, but at the moment, their feedstock is small modular batteries. They have on power tools batteries for phones and computers, but effectively the flow of the actual EV batteries is still too small to justify the scale up to actually invest into the scale that you need for feeding. So you need international collaboration. Maybe not every country in Europe needs a recycling facility for EV batteries, but the battery passport may facilitate convergence of flow and allowing for the trade of sustainably recycled and produce again metals. So there's a lot of development, and yes, investment are still needed.
I can also add a bit about the latest research on recycling side, because I know our colleagues in Birmingham, they're doing a very good job at recycling. Recently, they launched their a demo factory as well to recycle permanent magnets and to remanufacture at the same time. So that's the other important thing. Like in recycling, it's not about creating the black mass and sending the black mass somewhere else to a different country, rather than, as Sam mentioned, we should develop that capability within that particular country to exploit the maximum use out of it. So these things are happening. A lot of research is being done. And some of the things we are also doing is trying to connect these technologies, which UK is very good at, is some of the industries, for example, in India, where they have a lot of users and a lot of like end-of-life material and products, where they can actually recycle and use those technologies. So India is doing a good job in recycling, but the thing is, what they're saying is their recycling process is very energy intensive, and that's again, it's not the outcome we want. Right? So it's always a trade-off between these different factors. So we're having this international collaboration will definitely help us accelerate, implement these things, and and scaling up afterwards.
Well, remind me how I'm doing on the timekeeping. I think probably we've reached 1 o'clock. We've reached the lunch break. So thank you very much to the panel. It was really fascinating. And thank you for all the visuals and the facts and the kind of some notes of optimism as we try to get on a trajectory of this for the next few decades. So with thanks again to Cambridge Zero for co-organising this with us. I invite you to chat with the panel. And when we have our lunch, you'll be back down in the City of London rooms where you were before. So, and then we have at least an hour for networking. Yeah, thank you.